The objective today is to modify existing programs to add and update variables to track information. So in this lesson, you'll learn the next step with using variables in programs by adding them to apps. There are a few things you need to understand about where you create variables in your code and how you refer to them. In this lesson, we show you how to do it, and you have to debug a few problems related to common issues that newcomers have with variables. You'll also use an if statement for the first time in this lesson in order to make a game change screens once the score reaches a certain value. And then we examine the difference between the equal sign operator and a new one, the double equal sign. Now the purpose of this is mostly a continuation and furthering of our understanding of variables and how they work. There are many pitfalls and misconceptions about variables and how to use them in programs for the early learner. Variables are often difficult to learn because they are not visual. They are abstract, and one must have a good mental model for what's happening in the computer and with program instructions in order to understand the code and develop one's own solution to problems. The topic and concept of variable scope is a big one in any programming language. However, since many languages do it differently, the concept of variable scope is tough. As a concept, though, variable scoping is a form of abstraction. A programming language lets you create variables with as narrow or broad a scope as you need to program a certain task. As a general practice, you usually want to create variables with the most narrow scope you can for the task at hand. So your think right share here is, what is the reason not to make every variable a global one? And now let's just dig deep into the definitions of these words. Variable scope dictates what portions of the code can see or use a variable, typically derived from where the variable was first created. So you have your global variable. Now this is a variable whose scope is global to the program. It can be used and updated by any part of the code. Its global scope is typically derived from the variable being declared that is created outside of any function, object, or method. And Mr. H's personal recommendation here is try to avoid the global variable as much as you can. Now here's the local variable definition. This is the good one. This is a variable with local scope is one that can only be seen, used, and updated by code within the same scope. Typically this means a variable was declared that is created inside a function and includes function parameter variables. So your think right share, what is the difference between the local and global variables? So I want you to look at this bit of code. You have a function that says onEvent and then an ID called an up button. When you click it, there's another function called setText that will look at the ID called countDisplayLabel. So there's going to be something being displayed, it looks like, and that thing that will be displayed is the word up arrow. So that sounds pretty logical. When you click the up arrow, the up button, it will now say up arrow. So if I click this right here, it should change to the word up arrow. And then if you click down, not surprisingly, what do you think will happen? Well, the code cuts off right here. So it says predict what the above code is doing, be descriptive, and use the words in the code. If you're really struggling, you can see what is going on by going to this link. So basically what you're seeing is another way to display text in your app besides console.log and write. There's a command called setText which will change the text of a component on a screen given its ID. This is a very powerful technique and one that you'll see used a lot. Now in just a moment you'll see what it looks like in action, but first a think right share. When you see up arrow as a parameter inside of quotes, what data type is this? If you really struggle with this, Wikipedia data type and look under 3.2.2 in the table of contents. So here it is in action. When you click the up arrow, it says let's count, and then it'll say a number. So every time you click, the number should increase. Think right share, this code has problems. What do you need to change to get the down arrow to count down? And for this, all you have to do is type in the code that you would insert here on line 9, bumping line 9 down 1. Type in the code that you would put here on canvas. So here's a softball question just to give you some good confidence, okay? I want you to spot the bug and fix it. Looking at this picture, what is the problem and how would you fix it? So the point of that last exercise is where you decide to create variables in your code, it matters a lot. In JavaScript, you have two choices: create a variable outside of a function or create a variable inside a function. The term for this concept is called variable scope, that decision, and the scope of a variable defines which parts of your code can access and modify the variable. So your think, write, share here is, in your own words, what is variable scope and why is it important to understand? So let's dig deeper into local variables now. Variables created within a function become local to the function. Local variables have local scope. They can only be accessed within the function. So in the example to the right, we say that age is local to some function, which means that only code within some function can access and modify the value age. Code that's outside this function cannot see or use this variable. So it says function, some function is the name of it, and now inside of it, the variable age is created, and thus right here it says local to. So this variable is local to some function, and only within this function can you use this variable. So now global variables, not surprisingly, will happen above the function where you start to create the function, that is. But since it's global, it can be used in any of the functions that you create. Now in your think, write, share here, it says predict which type of variable scope you think is most often used, and will your answer change depending on the type of program, that is a game or a website or a phone app. So why use local variables? They are useful temporary placeholders for data that you need to perform a computation of some kind. Often a program might have several functions that perform different but related tasks, and you'd like to reuse variable names. Since local variables are only recognized inside their functions, variables with the same name can be reused in different functions. Now the best example of this is function parameters. Function parameters are a form of local variable. They get created and initialized when a function is called. They get used while the function runs, and then they get destroyed when the function completes. So don't get stuck on the terminology here. Parameters are also variables. So all parameters are variables, but not all variables are parameters. It's kind of like saying all kids are students, but not all students are kids. You can be an adult like myself and consider yourself still a student and actively try to continue to learn every single day. But if you're a kid, that is somebody under the age of 18, you should be in school. Legally speaking, you're supposed to be in school, and thus being in school makes you a student. And here's some code that exemplifies the reason we don't want to use global variables all the time. If I wanted to create a function that draws a square, well, I need a variable that would determine its size. Now, that same size, the parameters for what makes that size will be different than the size of a triangle, or at least the parameters that go into a triangle. So remember, when you create a function, you put commands down here. So it might say something like, move forward by 10, and then it might say turn 45 degrees and move forward by 10 again. Those commands that are used to create a function, those commands are going to be different when you're drawing a square, even if each size of the square is 10 as well. You're turning right or left with a value of 90 degrees instead of 25. So the most common mistake is something you just experienced, accidentally recreating a variable inside a function when you intended to reference a global variable. Now when you create a variable inside a function and it happens to have the same name as a global variable, the local variable takes precedence and the function will try to use the local variable first. But I think it's just bad form to have two different types of variables name the same thing, so try to avoid that. Now, global variables are useful for keeping track of data over the lifetime of the program that's running. So maybe something like a video game score. You want to keep track of that score no matter what level you're on, because each level can add to the score. And in terms of good etiquette, where do you create these variables? Well, by convention, the global variables are created and initialized in the very first lines of code in a program. Your think, write, share, why are global variables useful? So stick to the convention. If you need a global variable in your program, create it and give it an initial value at the very top of your program. keep all global variables in a group at the top where you can look at them. For our programs coming up, we're particularly interested in global variables since that gives us the ability to remember data like the score of a game. Now let's wrap up class by bug hunting. These bugs will all relate to variables, so go squash them. So here we are at this link, and I will paste it on Canvas for your convenience. You start at the 9th bubble, try to make it to bubble 13. And if you want to use blocky text, that's totally fine. When you're all done with that, you have an IB connection to make. So based on this lesson, what do you think, which attribute is most reflective of this lesson? And your DOL is, once you get to bubble 13, I want you to click Remix at the top left to get a larger workspace going. And you're going to fill in code for line 3. It is missing something very important, a global variable that will help us keep score in the clicking apple game.